Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Daled, and Miyertza Hashem today we will be learning Daf Reish Mem Tes Amud Beis. However, we do have some unfinished business left on Reish Mem Tes Amud Aleph. We need to conclude Siman Shin Pei Aleph. We're going to pick up today 4 lines off the top of Reish Mem Tes Amud Aleph with Siman Shin Pei Aleph Sif Hey. Now, at first glance, it looks a tiny bit daunting. It looks like we have quite a bit left on Reish Mem Tes Amud Aleph. However, if you take a look down at the Mishnah Berurah, you'll see that there's relatively little Mishnah Berurah left here on Reish Mem Tes Amud Aleph, and indeed, there isn't that much Mishnah Berurah to cover on Reish Mem Tes Amud Beis, so we should be able to do this within our time constraints. Our learning today should be a schus for Acheinu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanisunim Batzaru Ba'Shivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem, V'Yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Ora Mishibur L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Amar Amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Achi Agadol Mashemer Ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha, Rivka Bashira Leah, Chavadasa Bas Rezel Serel, Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malkachana, and Yerucham Ben Masha. They should all have a refuah shalema b'soy shar Chole Yisrael. I am recording this shir on Lag Ba'omer evening, and I guess everyone should have a Simcha Dika day. The number one thing that you could do to commemorate the Yom Hilula of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, you want to commemorate the life of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the number one thing that you could do is open up a sefer and learn Torah. That is more effective than a hadlaka, than any other interesting minhagim that have sprung up over the years. The number one thing you could do, Rabbi Sai, is open up a sefer and learn Torah. That is it. Maybe even open up a Gemara and learn Gemara. That's Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the Tana Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. According to some, the Mechaber of the Zohar, definitely to take out a Gemara, sit down. Maybe you want to join Daf Yomi. Daf Yomi just started Masechtas Chulin a couple of days ago. I believe today was Daf Gimel in Daf Yomi. It's an auspicious time for people who want to expand their Torah learning. Pick up a Chulin Gemara, join a Daf Yomi share. And, sometimes people say, I'll start with the next Masechta. I'll start at the beginning of the next Perek. So my brother, Rav Moshe Meir, used to say all the time to people who he would ask them, "No, start learning Daf Yomi." I'll start with the next Masechta. When are you starting the next Masechta? Moshe Meir would say, "Listen, if you start today, you'll finish Shas in 7.5 years from today. If you wait till tomorrow, then you'll finish Shas 7.5 years from tomorrow. If you wait 6 weeks, you're going to finish Shas 7.5 years from 6 weeks from now. If you would have started yesterday, you would have finished Shas 7.5 years from yesterday. What are you waiting for the beginning of the next Masechta? Whatever blot it is, 7.5 years later, when you hit that daf, you will have made a siyum on Shas." So there's no excuses, Rabbi Yisai. And nowadays, you can have shir in any language that you want, and you have art scroll in English, art scroll in Hebrew, art scroll in French, the Mesifta Gemara, there's so many aids and everything else. There are so many shiurim, beautiful, unbelievable shiurim. Happens to be, I pride myself, I said a Daf Yomi shir, and I think I said a very, very good Daf Yomi shir. There are shiurim out there nowadays that are unbelievable. I mean, Reb Srili Borenstein, what an unbelievable shir. If you want to have a little bit more of a more in-depth flavor, he says a beautiful shir. You want a lighter flavor, there's Rav Eli Stefanski, what an unbelievable phenomenon his shir is. But then you have shiurim in Yiddish. You have I know somebody who says a 3-hour Daf Yomi shir every day. Rishonim, Achronim, Paiskim. There's every type and every flavor. There's early in the morning. There's late at night. There's online. There's live. It's just unbelievable what's out there. Okay, now I could get off my soapbox and let's get back to our regularly scheduled broadcast. 4 lines off the top of Reish Mem Tes Amud Aleph, Siman Shin Pei Aleph Sif Hey, continuing to learn the halachas of Iruv Chatzeros, and specifically focusing on the concept of somebody being mevatel reshus to somebody else, somebody being mesalik himself, relinquishing his rights on a chotzer, on a bias, so that he shouldn't have a negative effect on the other people that he was asering on. Says the Mechaber, Shnei Batim b'Shnei Tzidei Rishus Harabim. Very interesting case. You have two houses. In the world of Iruvei Chatzeros, these houses have nothing to do with each other. One house is located on one side of the Rishus Harabim, the other house is located across the street on the other side of the Rishus Harabim. They have nothing to do with each other. They don't aser on each other, and you're not allowed to transfer from one to the other. They're on two different sides of the Rishus Harabim. They have no shaykhis, Rabbi Yisai. They have nothing to do with each other. But now, what happened? V'kifum einam Yehudim mechitza b'Shabbos. Construction, Eina Yehudi construction workers showed up on Shabbos. They put out their cones blocking the Rishus Harabim, and they erected walls cutting off the Rishus Harabim and surrounding these two houses. So here you have the two houses, one on one side of Rishus Harabim, one on the other. Now construction workers came and they built walls. They made a wall here, right? You've got your two houses, and they built a wall here. And now, guess what? Now the two houses are surrounded with mechitzas, and what used to be a Rishus Harabim in between them is now effectively a chotzer. So when Ben Hashmoshes came on the beginning of Shabbos, these two houses had nothing to do with each other. But now in the middle of Shabbos, the Einam Yehudim came, and basically they created a chotzer around these two houses, and now these two houses share a chotzer. Okay, are they allowed to transfer kelim sheshafsu babayis? Items that started off Shabbos inside their homes. Could they transfer them to the chotzer? Could they transfer something that started off in the street, which is now a chotzer, back into the houses? Could they say, oh, look at that. Now maybe we're allowed to carry from one house to the other house, because now we're in a chotzer surrounded by mechitzas. Is any of that mutter? No, it's all aser. Because they're in a chotzer, they're two individual houses sharing a chotzer, they aser on each other. Now, some of you are going to look, and some of you are going to say, well, 1 second, these mechitzas weren't there at beginning of Shabbos by Ben Hashmoshes, maybe they don't count. No, the halacha is, and we've seen this already in the past, that a mechitza that's built on Shabbos is shema mechitza. It is a real mechitza. It has all, when Goyim put up a mechitza on Shabbos, all the halachic ramifications of those mechitzas kick in on Shabbos. Some of you are going to want to say, well, Shabbos kevitcha hutra hutra. No, this is not an aspect of Shabbos kevitcha hutra hutra. Shabbos kevitcha hutra hutra is when at the beginning of Shabbos at Ben Hashmoshes, you had an Erev. You had a situation that required an Erev, and there was an Erev. And then something happened to bring down the Erev on Shabbos. And when I say bring down the Erev, I mean Iruvei Chatzeros. I don't mean our strings and posts. That's not what I mean. Remember, that's not an Erev. Those are wow, the term just fell out of my... Tzuras HaPesach. Those are Tzuras HaPesachs that make mechitzos. It's not an Erev. The Erev is the Iruvei Chatzeros. If something happens to obviate an Iruvei Chatzeros on Shabbos, in many instances we say Shabbos kevitcha hutra hutra. But over here, this is not a point of Shabbos kevitcha hutra hutra. When Shabbos came in, it wasn't mutter to carry from one house to the other. When Shabbos came in, these houses are no shaykhis to each other. One is on one side of Rishus Harabim, one's on the other side of Rishus Harabim. This is not Shabbos kevitcha hutra hutra, right? The mechitzas went up on Shabbos. Now they aser on each other. So says the Mechaber, let's go weiter. Shnei batim b'shnei tzidei Rishus Harabim v'ikifam einam Yehudim mechitza b'Shabbos. The Goyim surrounded them on mechitza on Shabbos be'inyan sheyesh beinehem k'may chotzer, in such a manner that now they're basically inside of a chotzer. Sheshnei batim psuchim loy. It's a chotzer that has two houses into it. V'harei mehem oisrim zalzeh, so that they aser on each other, right? And now they don't have an Erev, obviously. Says the Mechaber, einam yecholim levatel kol echad lechaveroi. You might be tempted to think, okay, this situation happened on Shabbos. Maybe now Ruvain in bias A, in the first house, turns to Shimon in bias B across the street, and he says, you know what, Shimon? I'll be mevatel rishus to you. So now you could go take a lawn chair out of your house, a keli sheshavas babayis, bring it out into the newly created chotzer, and sit down outside and learn the daf outside. Right? Bittul Rishus, says the Mechaber. No. Over here, You cannot use bittul rishus. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan chaf hey. Einam yechelim levatel. Why not? Now, first of all, why does he want to be mevatel? Kedei sheyuchal chaveroi lehishtamesh. What Ruvain was trying to accomplish, he wanted to be a nice guy. He knows that Shimon likes the outdoors. He wanted to be mevatel rishus to Shimon, so now Shimon could make use of the newly created chotzer. He could transfer a chair from inside his house out to the chotzer. That's what Ruvain wanted to accomplish. But the Mechaber said bittul rishus in this case doesn't work. Now, the Mechaber didn't say why. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you why. Vatam, the reason is, since on Friday afternoon, and when Ben Hashmashos arrived, Friday evening, there was no possibility of an Erev here. When Shabbos arrived, again, these two houses had nothing to do with each other in the world of Eruv Chatzeros. So when Shabbos arrived, and when the Siman of Knias Erev, when the time that an Erev would usually kick in by Ben Hashmashos, there was no possibility of an Erev here, because there was no Chatzer. Amrinan Kevin Chenesar Lemiktas HaShabbos. Now we say, once for part of Shabbos this was Aser, Nesar L'chol HaShabbos, it remains Aser for the entirety of Shabbos, V'loi Mahani Bittul, and Bittul is not effective. Now, when you read those words, and these words are pretty much taken from the Gemara, when you read those words, you're tempted to look at it and say, okay, so now we just learned a new klal. Shabbos kevin shenesra nesra. We've dealt with Shabbos kevin shehutra hutra, that when something was mutter at the beginning of Shabbos, it remains mutter. Now we have over here a new concept, Shabbos kevin shenesra nesra. Now, we've had such a concept in Chele Gimel, let's say by Muktzah, right? If something is muktzah l'ben hashmashos, it's muktzah l'kulei alma. So maybe now over here in the world of Eruv Chatzeros, we have Shabbos kevin shenesra nesra. But that's not really true. So the question is exactly how to learn pshat in this. If you want to take a look, there is an interesting Dirshu footnote, number 23, and they bring down the Chazon Ish. I think the Chazon Ish's pshat is the most easily understood over here. And that is that you have to understand the underpinnings of bittul rishus. The Chazal created this concept of multiple dwellings inside of a chotzer asering on each other. The whole thing is a din d'Rabbanan. They created a mechanism of Eruv Chatzeros so that you could turn what would be an issa d'Rabbanan into a heter, into something which is mutter, right? They also created a kula. The kula that they created was that in many instances, which we've been covering copiously over the last several days, in many instances, if you failed to make a proper Eruv Chatzeros, there is this concept of bittul rishus. So that really there's a flaw over here in the Eruv Chatzeros, right? Let's say Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda joined in the Eruv Chatzeros. Reuven was left out. So now there's a flaw in the Eruv Chatzeros. We could rectify the flaw. We could repair the situation by employing this kula of bittul rishus. But, says the Chazon Ish, when Eruv Chatzeros was not negeya at the beginning of Shabbos, when there was absolutely no possibility of Eruv when Shabbos began, like in our case over here, two houses across the street from each other in a Rishus Harabim, they're not in a chotzer. There's no possibility of a Eruv Chatzeros between these two houses. The whole possibility of Eruv Chatzeros was only created on Shabbos when Goyim came and surrounded these houses by mechitzos. In that case, there's no possibility of bittul rishus. Bittul rishus is kind of like a subcategory of Eruv Chatzeros. It's a heter, it's a kula in the world of Eruv Chatzeros. But if when Shabbos came in, there was no possibility of Eruv Chatzeros, there's no possibility of bittul rishus. Okay, moving along to Sifav, 4 lines off the bottom, end of the line. Yeah. Okay, I think I spoke improperly. Though earlier I said 4 lines off the top. Now we're up to 4 lines off the bottom. Sivav. Says the Mechaber. Yoirish, somebody who inherits Rishus in a chotzer, Yoirish mevatel Rishus. A Yoirish, an inheritor, can be mevatel Rishus. she'em loy erev ma'rishai, meaning that if the person who bequeathed a reshus to this inheritor did not make an erev when he was still alive before Shabbos, umeis b'Shabbos, and he died on Shabbos, v'hayoirish ba'lador b'chotzer, and now the Yorish is coming to move into the house that he inherited in the chotzer on Shabbos, v'oiser, and now he's asering on the other b'nei chotzer, yachal levatel reshusai, he's allowed to be mevatel reshus. Okay, what did we just say? So you've got a chotzer. In the chotzer, you've got Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Okay, maybe they all wanted to make it a Ruvain Chatzeros, but Ruvain dissented. Ruvain said, whatever, Me'ezatam, I'm not interested in making it a Ruvain Chatzeros. So now, right now, there's no Ruvain Chatzeros. Or maybe, let's make the case even better. Maybe, it's not that Ruvain said, I don't want to make it a Ruvain Chatzeros. Ruvain, technically speaking, was agreeable to make it a Ruvain Chatzeros, but he never got around to doing it. So now we have a case where Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, they joined in an Ruvain Chatzeros. So again, an attempt was made to make it a Ruvain Chatzeros. Somebody went ahead, collected pas, they were mazaket a pas, they did the whole thing. Problem is, Ruvain was left out. All right, so do you have any Ruvain Chatzeros now? No. You have Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. They're joined in a Ruvain Chatzeros. Ruvain was left out. Ruvain asers on the other b'nei chotzer. Okay. Ruvain dies on Shabbos. All right. Ruvain dies. Ruvain has a son. Ruvain has a son, Yaakov. I know, it's backwards, right? Ruvain has a son, Yaakov. Yaakov inherited Ruvain's house. Now let's play out the math here, okay? Ruvain is now out of the picture. He's out of the chotzer. He died. Yaakov lives 2 blocks down in a different chotzer. All right. If Yaakov does not move into the chotzer on Shabbos, what's the halacha of this chotzer? Well, Shimon and Levi and Yehuda are joined in a Ruvain Chatzeros. Ruvain is now dead. Ruvain's house is a dira b'loi bailim. Ruvain's house has nobody living in it. A dira b'loi bailim does not aser on the other b'nei chotzer. So until Ruvain died, Tiltal in this chotzer was aser. They weren't allowed to transfer keli sheshavsu babayis to the chotzer or vice versa, because the chotzer was serving multiple entities, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, and Ruvain. But now Ruvain died. Again, Ruvain's out of the picture. So now Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda have a good Ruvain Chatzeros as long as Ruvain's house remains empty. Because if Ruvain's house is empty, it's a dira b'loi bailim. Dira b'loi bailim doesn't aser. But now Yaakov, Ruvain's son from 2 blocks down, decided, you know what? I'm moving in. On Shabbos, I'm moving in. I've been living in a shack. My father had a nice house. I'm moving in. I'm going to have shalashidis in my father's old house. I'm moving in. As soon as Yaakov moves in to his deceased father's house, he is now once again, he has diurin in the chotzer. Now Ruvain's house is again a reshus that asers in the chotzer. It's no longer a dira b'loi bailim. Yaakov moved in. So now he asers. Says the Mechaber, there's an eitzah. The eitzah is Yaakov could be mevatel reshus. So Yaakov moves in. Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda say to Yaakov, Oivei, you moved in. As long as you weren't here, your father's house was a dira b'loi bailim. He wasn't asering on us. But now you moved in. Now you're asering on us. Now we can't bring Mishnah out to the Pirkei Avos. Says Yaakov, no problem. I'll be mevatel reshus. I'll be mevatel my reshus in the chotzer to you. Now you guys can take Mishnah out of your houses to the chotzer for the Pirkei Avos. What's the chiddush over here? The chiddush is that Sivav is coming right after Sif Hey. In Sif Hey we said, well, there was no Ruvain Chatzeros when Shabbos came in. You can't create an Ruvain Chatzeros on Shabbos, right? In Sivav, there was no possibility of an Ruvain Chatzeros on Erev Shabbos because the houses weren't surrounded by mechitzos. They weren't in a chotzer. Now, you can't be mevatel reshus on Shabbos afternoon. And that you can't make it a Ruvain Chatzeros. You can't be mevatel reshus. You can't use bittel. If there was no Ruvain Chatzeros when Shabbos came, you can't use bittel now. So too over here, there was no Ruvain Chatzeros when Shabbos came. So now could you do bittul rishus? Says the Mechaber, yes, you can do bittul rishus. Why? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut chavav. V'hayoyrish ba'ladar b'chatzav ha'yser. Avol im loy haya ba'ladar. I explained this outside. If the son Yaakov does not come to live in the chatzar on Shabbos, ein ha'yser abanei ha'chatzar. Ruvain's house, the deceased's house, is not going to answer on the other b'nei ha'chatzar once he dies. The dira b'loi bailim loy shma dira, because now it's a dira b'loi bailim. A dira b'loi bailim doesn't answer. The chanal b'simin shenayin al sivdalit. V'ayin la'el masha kasav nusham b'biyar alacha. In this case, Yaakov, the inheritor, can use bittul rishus. He can be mevatel rishus to the other b'nei ha'chatzar. Says the Mishnah Berurah, after ibayil iruve me esmail loy motzi ma'arif. Could Yaakov have made an eruve chatzeros yesterday on Erev Shabbos? No, he wasn't the owner of the house. So you might look at this and you might say, oh, there was no possibility of an eruve chatzeros on Erev Shabbos. Because who's doing the bittul rishus? Yaakov. Could Yaakov have joined in a Eruv Chatzeros on Erev Shabbos? No, it wasn't his house. So in a sense, you might look at this and say that it's similar to the previous if. There was no possibility of an Eruv Chatzeros. Therefore, there should be no possibility of bittul. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, we don't say that. Afilu hachi mahani bitulai, his bittul is still effective. Why? Mishum deyoirish karidavuahu. Because we don't look at Yaakov as being distinct from Ruvain. Literally, the words mean, and this is a concept found in many places in Shas, Yoirish, a son who inherits the property from his father, Karei da'avua, he's the feet of the father, meaning that the son is seen as being in place of the father. The father could have made an Eruv Chatzeros on Erev Shabbos. He just neglected to do so, but he could have. So since a Ruvain could have made an Eruv Chatzeros on Erev Shabbos, we look at Yaakov, his son, that he also could have made an Eruv Chatzeros on Erev Shabbos, and therefore bittul rishus is effective. Moving along to the final sif in this beautiful Siman, Sif Zayin, 2 lines off the bottom, says the Mechaber. Mevatlin v'choizrin u'mevatlin. You could do bittul rishus in one direction, and then after you have gained the benefits of that bittul rishus, now you could do a bittul rishus in the other direction, and you could gain the benefits of the bittul rishus in that direction. Koloimar, that means to say, says the Mechaber, Shemivatlim, he's going to give 2 scenarios. Shemivatlim rishusam b'nei chotzer zu leb'nei chotzer acheres. Chotzer A could be mevatel rishus to chotzer B. Now let's pause here for a second, okay? 2 chatzeros, chatzer A, chatzer B. They did not join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. Chatzer A made its own Eruv Chatzeros. Chatzer B made its own Eruv Chatzeros. Each chatzer is allowed to transfer from their houses to the chatzer, from the chatzer to their houses. But they cannot transfer from a house in one chatzer to the chatzer in the other chatzer, or from the chatzer in one chatzer to a house in the other chatzer. They can't do that in either direction. Why? Because they didn't join in a joint Eruv Chatzeros. So now on Shabbos you can employ bittul rishus. So let's do that. Chatzer A will be mevatel rishus to chatzer B. Once chatzer A is mevatel rishus to chatzer B, so now chatzer B owns both chatzeros, right? So now chatzer B, if there's a big kiddush in chatzer A, the residents of chatzer B could take pitchers of lemonade from their houses in chatzer B, and they could bring them to the kiddush in chatzer A, because chatzer A was mevatel rishus to chatzer B. All right, so Shabbos morning, for the kiddush, that's what's going to happen. A guy who lives in chatzer B is going to take a pitcher of lemonade from his house in chatzer B and bring it to the kiddush in the chatzer in chatzer A. But now, Shabbos afternoon, there's a Pirkei Avos drasha. And the Pirkei Avos drasha is in the chatzer of chatzer B. So now somebody who lives in a house in chatzer A wants to take a mishnayos from his house in chatzer A and bring it to the chatzer in chatzer B. Now he can't, because chatzer A was mevatel the rishus of their chatzer to chatzer B. To take a mishnayos out of a house in chatzer A and bring it out to either one of the chatzeros is aser, because those chatzeros belong now to chatzer B. Says the Mechaber, you know what you could do? You could do mevatlin v'chayzrin u'mevatlin. What you'll do is, in the morning before the Kiddush in Chotzer A will be mevatel rishus to Chotzer B. And then after the Suda Shabbos afternoon, before the Pirkei Avos drasha, Chotzer B will be mevatel rishus to Chotzer A. Now, you can't go in both directions at the same time. In the morning, you could take a pitcher of lemonade from a house in Chotzer B and bring it to the Chotzer of Chotzer A, because Chotzer A was mevatel rishus to Chotzer B. And that will work for the whole day until such time as the people of Chotzer B decide to be mevatel rishus to Chotzer A. When the people of Chotzer B then turn around and are mevatel rishus to Chotzer A, now the guy in Chotzer A could take a mishnayos from his house in Chotzer A and bring it to the Chotzer in Chotzer B. But now no more lemonade from Chotzer B to Chotzer A. That you can't do. You can't have it go in both directions at the same time. But the chiddush over here is that we don't say, oh, you only get one shot at Bittul Rishus on Shabbos, and it remains that way for the rest of Shabbos. No. You could do Bittul Rishus in one direction at one point in Shabbos, and then later you could reverse it, and you could do Bittul Rishus in the other direction. That works. That was scenario number one. Scenario number two, says the Mechaber, Oy le'echad mibnei chotzer ad sheyitziu ma sheyitzru v'chayzinu mevatlim lo'isem shebitul lehem ad sheyitziu gam he ma sheyitzu. What's the second scenario? Oy le'echad mibnei chotzer. Let's say you have Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda in a chotzer, right? Ruvain got left out of the Yeruva Chatzeros. Now, Shabbos, Ruvain has a pressing need to take something out of his house to the chotzer. Maybe Ruvain's the one that's making the Kiddush. And the herring and the kichel are in Ruvain's house. So Ruvain's not part of the Yeruva Chatzeros. Really, there's no Yeruva Chatzeros, right? Because Ruvain was left out. Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda could be mevatel rishus to Ruvain. Now Ruvain could take the herring out of his house and bring it out to the chotzer. No problem. Now, until he takes out what he needs to take out. The now you can go in the other direction. Now later on, Ruvain could be mevatel rishus to Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Now, I want to be clear. I don't want anybody to get confused. The words achi yitziu mashi yirtzu v'chayzrim umevatlim la'oisam shebitlu lahem achi yitziu gamheim mashi yirtzu is all lashon rabbim. Because the last phraseology, the ending phraseology of the Siman, is not going back only on the second scenario where you have an echad and a rabbim. It's going back on the first scenario too, where you have a rabbim and a rabbim. Just to be clear about that. Okay. So again, the chiddush over here is you could do bittul in one direction, you could then reverse it back and do bittul in the other direction. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kan Chav Ches, the chayzrim umevatlim la'oisam. Now, this Mishnah Berurah is going on scenario number one. So in scenario number one, you have a rabbim and a rabbim. You have Chotzer A, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. You have Chotzer B, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Va'asher. So you have a rabbim and a rabbim. First, Chotzer B was mevatel to Chotzer A. Then Chotzer A was mevatel to Chotzer B. Right? Chotzer B was mevatel to Chotzer A, so Chotzer A could bring the lemonade out to the Kiddush. Then Chotzer A was mevatel to Chotzer B, so Chotzer B could take mishnayos out to the Pirkei Avos drasha. Right? That's what happened. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chav Ches, v'chayzrim mevatel lo yisam. Avol, in this scenario, avolim lo yahayu chayzrim mevatel lahem. If you didn't do the later chayzer umevatel, right? Let's play it out, right? Let's say the way it started was Chotzer A was mevatel rishus to Chotzer B. Once Chotzer A is mevatel rishus to Chotzer B, Chotzer A is not allowed to take anything out of their houses to any of the Chatzeros. Because once the people of Chotzer A are mevatel rishus to Chotzer B, their houses are now distinct from both Chatzeros. You can't transfer from those houses to either of the Chatzeros because they relinquished their rights to the Chatzeros. The Chatzeros belong to B, right? Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you don't reverse the bittul, What the Mechaber says you could do is, later on, Chotzer B could be Mevatel to Chotzer A. When Chotzer B is Mevatel to Chotzer A, now the houses in Chotzer A, they can take Mishnayos out of their houses, out to either Chotzer. But what if they don't do that? What if they never Chayzer Umevatel? Says the Mishnah Berurah, realize, if Chotzer B does not reverse the bittel, if Chotzer B is not Mevatel Rishus to Chotzer A, then even if when Chotzer A did their bittel Rishus, they were Mevatel Rishus even over their houses, they still won't be allowed to take a Mishnayos out of their house to the Chotzer. Why not? If they were Mevatel Rishus on their houses and their Chotzer, don't their houses and their Chotzer all belong to Chotzer B? Maybe technically, yeah. But now, since they're a Rabbim and a Rabbim is not Nasa Oireach Eitzel a Rabbim. Remember that from yesterday? So now what happens if the people of Chotzer A take something out of their houses and put it into the Chotzer? Nire kechayzer umachzik b'rishusay shepitel. They're using the Chotzer. They're taking something out of their house and they're using the Chotzer. That would be a problem of chayzer umevatel rishusay shepitel. Chayzer umachzik b'rishusay shepitel. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here. Aval im loya yuchayzin mevatel lehem. If Chotzer B doesn't turn around and reverse the bittel and be mevatel rishus to Chotzer A, loyhayu mutarim hamevatel lahoitzi. The mevatlim, the people of Chotzer A, would not be allowed to take anything out from their houses to either Chotzer. Afilu bittel gam rishus bateim. Even if when they did the bittel rishus, they were mevatel the rishus over their houses as well, so that their houses technically also belong to Chotzer B. Hayel v'hem Rabbim, because they're a Rabbim. Ve'enam nasim orchim, they cannot be considered orchim by the other Chotzer. K'masher kaseh b'simin should pay, and therefore it would be a problem of nirek k'chayzer or machzik b'reshusay shebitel. Now, if you would have asked me if that piece of Siman Shin Pei Aleph was going to take 32 minutes, I would have said no way. Having said that, let's move on. Reish Mem Tesam and Beis. Siman Shin Pei Beis im diras eina Yehudi ma'akeves be'eruvai. Let's say we've always been dealing with Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Let's say in a Chotzer you have Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and Tony. Does Tony create a problem? Tony's house. Does Tony aser on the other Bnei Chotzer? That's the topic of Shin Pei Beis, says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Hadar im akum bechotzer. If somebody lives together with an Eina Yehudi in a Chotzer. So what's this case? There's only two houses in the Chotzer. Reuven and Tony. There's one Yid, one Eina Yehudi. Does the Eina Yehudi aser on Reuven? So now Reuven cannot take a Keli Sheshavas Babayis out to the Chotzer because the Chotzer is a shared Rishus. Who's it shared between? Reuven and Tony? Do we say that? Hadar im aku b'chotzer einoi oiser alav. The Eina Yehudi does not aser on the Yid. Ad until sheyu shnei Yisraelim darim b'shnei batim. The Eina Yehudi only becomes a problem when you have a minimum of two Yidden, Reuven and Shimon, living b'shnei batim, living in two separate houses, the oisrim zeh al zeh, so that you already have an Eruv Chatzeris issue. If you have Reuven and Shimon living together in a Chotzer, Reuven in one house, Shimon in another house, so now the Chotzer is already a joint Rishus, it's serving Reuven and Shimon, so you already need an Eruv Chatzeris, because Reuven and Shimon are answering on each other, then Oz Ha'akum Oyser Aleim. Now Tony becomes part of the equation. Now Tony is also a problem. How do we deal with Tony? Says the Mechaber, don't think that Tony the guy could use bittul rishus. Don't think you could walk over to Tony and you say, look, Tony, all we need from you is you should just say that you're mevatel your rishus. Well, what does that mean? You're relinquishing your rights in the Chotzer. Don't worry, there's an HOA, you're still protected. But for us, for our Jewish law problems, the strings and everything else, we need you to say that you're relinquishing your rights. No. That doesn't work. No bittul rishus by an Eina Yehudi. El tzarich sheyaskiru mimenu. What you need to do is you need to pay him, and you need to rent from him his rishus. So play it out. Again, Ruvain and Tony, only 2 houses in the Chatzar. Ruvain is free and clear. Tony doesn't answer on him. He's an Ein Yehudi. He doesn't answer. Ruvain, Shimon, and Tony, well, they already know Ruvain and Shimon that they have a problem, right? Because there's Ruvain and Shimon. But they want to just get together and make it a Ruvain Chatzeris. They want to forget about Tony. No, you can't do that. Tony's a problem. Now that you needed a Ruvain Chatzeris, now Tony's a problem. What do you do about Tony? Could he use Bittul Rishus? No, can't use Bittul Rishus. What do you have to do? Achi Askiru Mimenu. You have to rent his Rishus from him. Or you have to buy his Rishus from him. You got to pay him. Could be a quarter. But you got to get him to agree to this. Okay? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Oiskat Aleph. Ene Oiser Alav, the guy does not aser on the Yid. If it's only a guy and a Yid, 1 and 1, he doesn't aser. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. The first thing you have to understand for this siman is that me'ikar adin, the dira of an Ein Yehudi, is not a dira in the world of a Ruvain Chatzeris. Really, me'ikar adin? It's as if the Ein Yehudi is not here. And that's why 1 and 1, the Ein Yehudi doesn't answer. Ella, the Chachamim Gazru. This is a Gzeira that the Chachamim made. The whole Ruvain Chatzeris is a Gzeira. Another Gzeira that the Chachamim made is the lesser alav that an Ein Yehudi does aser on the other Yidden. Why? Kedei shelo yader imai, because we don't want you to live in a chutzner with Ein Yehudi. You live in a chutzner with an Ein Yehudi, we're going to make you problems. We're going to make your life hard for you. Why don't we want you living in a chutzner with an Ein Yehudi? Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'yom might me myself. You're going to start learning from him. You have an Ein Yehudi living in the chutzner. He's going to be blaring his music. Maybe you're going to like his music. Or your kids are going to like his music. They're going to start listening to it too. You're going to see him, the way he barbecues and smokes his meat and everything else. You're going to start picking up stuff from the Ein Yehudi. We don't want you picking up stuff from the Ein Yehudi. So therefore, we don't want you living in a chutzner with an Ein Yehudi. So we make your life a little difficult. But, so wait a second. So if we're saying that the Chachamim said that a guy does aser, so how come by 1 and 1 it doesn't aser? Why don't we say that Tony asers on Ruvain, even if the only 2 in the chutzner? After all, we don't want Ruvain living with Tony in the chutzner. Not only that, maybe as far as learning from the Ein Yehudi, maybe 1 and 1 is even worse. If there's 10 Yidden living in the chutzner and there's 1 guy, so maybe we don't have to be so afraid that the Yidden are going to learn from the guy. But if it's only Ruvain and Tony, then there's a good chance Ruvain's going to learn from Tony. So how come he's not a problem? How come Tony doesn't answer? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. V'loi gazru ela b'davar d'shchiach. Remember, when it comes to Dinei D'Rabbanan, the Chachamim only made the gzeros when something is shchiach, when something is common. If it's not common, they didn't address uncommon situations with gzera D'Rabbanan. V'loi gazru ela b'davar d'shchiach. Ta'inu b'makom shedarim kami Yisraelim. It's not shchiach to have a chutzner of 1 Yid and 1 guy. You know why? Avaloi b'chad bayis. We're not worried. 1 and 1. Who's going to be crazy enough to be the only Yid in a chutzner with Einam Yehudim? The Einam Yehudim achoshat ashvichas damim. What are you, nuts? You're going to be the only Yid living in a chutzner with Goyim? You're not going to do that. Memel, it's not shchiach. Since it's not shchiach, it wasn't covered by the gzera. Weiter, ice cut and base. So, when the Mechaber gave the requirements for when a guy does aser, what did the Mechaber say? You need Shnei Yisraelim, 2 Yidden, Darim b'Shnei Batim, living in a minimum of 2 houses, V'oisrim Zalzeh, in a manner that they would aser on each other. So really we kind of said 3 things. Says the Mishnah Berurah Beis b'Shnei Batim. First of all, the Yidden have to be living in 2 houses. Avo b'chad bayis. But let's say you have multiple Yidden, but they all live in 1 house. Then says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu yesh kama anoshim, even if there's a lot of Yidden, a lot of men, living in 1 house together, va'oichlim kol echad b'fnei atzmai, and they all eat on their own. They all eat separately. Still, says the Mishnah Berurah, kechad chashivi, that's considered 1, and therefore the guy is not going to aser. A little cryptic, the way the Mishnah Berurah wrote this. If you take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan spelled it out a little clearer, right? Let's say you have 2 houses in the chutzner. 1 house has 5 Yidden living in it. Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. The other house is Tony. let's take a look at the house that has Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. If it's a true multiple family dwelling, if it's a 5-apartment dwelling, Reuven is one apartment, Shimon is another apartment, Levi is another apartment, Yehuda has another apartment, right? And they all have their own kitchens, they all eat apart, well then guess what? They need an Eruv Chatzeros. In their own building, they need an Eruv Chatzeros. They aser on each other inside that building, right? It's 5 dwellings inside one bias. 5 separate dwellings. 5 rooms, each one with their own kitchen, each one with their own door. It's an apartment building with 5 apartments. You need an Eruv Chatzeros inside that apartment building. In that case, says the Aruch HaShulchan, you have a problem with Tony. You would have to be masker rishus from Tony. Once you need an Eruv Chatzeros, then Tony becomes a problem. Now, it's true. You might look at this and you might say, I don't need an Eruv Chatzeros in the Chatzer. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. If this building has a front door that opens up onto the Chatzer is serving these 5 multiple dwellings. So you need an Eruv Chatzeros. So then Tony becomes a problem and you have to be masker rishus from Tony. What the Mishnah Berurah means over here, that you don't need, that the guy does not aser, and you don't need to be masker rishus from the guy when you have multiple Yisraelim living in one house, he means in a way that they don't aser on each other. What would that be? It's not an apartment building with 5 apartments. It's not even a big house with 5 separate rooms, and they all eat in their 5 separate rooms. It's a big studio apartment. It's a big barracks, and they all live in one room, so they don't aser on each other. It's one room. The chiddush is, even though there's multiple yidden, in other words, don't think that what the Mechaber is saying is, as long as you have multiple yidden, then the guy asers. Because again, why does the guy aser? The guy asers because of Gzeres Chachamim. What's the Gzeres Chachamim? We don't want you living in a chutzner together with a guy. But we're only geyser when it's shriach, right? Well, over here it would be shriach. When it's one guy and one yid, or 10 guyim and one yid, it's not shriach. The guyim achoshal shvichas damim, who would be crazy enough to be the only yid together with the guyim. So then the guy doesn't aser. But in this case, you've got 10 yidden. They're all living in one room. But you've got 10 yidden and one guy. Maybe the guy asers? No. Says the Aruch HaShulchan. You know why? Because it's bechlal not common that 10 yidden would be living in one room. Unless they're family members. What are they all doing living in one room? So that's also not shchiach, and therefore he doesn't answer. So again, when it says over here that they have to be bishnei batim in 2 houses, you could have a case where it's really one house, one building, an apartment building with 5 apartments. Then Tony would be a problem. But if it's one house, the Mechaber said it has to be 2 houses. If it's one house with a lot of Yidden, but they don't aser on each other because they're all b'cheder echad, then Tony is not going to be a problem. Oiskan Gimel, v'oisrim zeh al zeh. Another requirement, you need at least 2 Yidden living in at least 2 houses, and they have to aser on each other. Says the Mishnah Berurah La Fuke. This comes to exclude the following case. Let's say you do have 2 houses, 2 Yiddish houses, right? But even though you have 2 Yiddish houses, they don't aser on each other. How do you have a case where you have 2 Yiddish houses that don't aser on each other? Says the Mishnah Berurah, going for example, of Ubanov. Maybe you have 13 houses. You have Yaakov, who's the father, living in one house. Then you have Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, etc., etc. And they all have their own houses. So you have 13 houses. You have the 12 Shvatim, and you have Yaakov. You have 13 Yiddish houses. But they don't aser on each other. Why? Why don't they aser on each other? Shemikabel pras me'itai. They all get their food from Yaakov Avinu, and they all eat together in Yaakov Avinu's house. So you have 13 houses, but it's a father and his children. The father is supporting all his children, and they all eat together at Yaakov's table. So yeah, you have multiple Yidden and multiple houses, but they don't aser on each other. In that case, also, Tony doesn't become a problem. In such a case, they don't ask around each other and they don't need to make an Erev. Even though they all live in their own independent house, in such a case, the Ein Yehudi is not going to answer on them. You don't have to be masker rishus from the Ein Yehudi. But if you have at least two Yidden in two separate houses, and they do aser on each other, now the Ein Yehudi asers on the other two Yidden, says the Mishnah Berurah. What does that mean? Reuven and Shimon can make it a Reuven Chaseres, but it's not going to be effective. It is only going to work if they're masker rishus from Tony. If they're masker rishus from Tony, then they can make it a Reuven Chaseres. But if they try to join in a Reuven Chaseres without being masker rishus, it won't be effective, because Tony is going to aser on them. The Einoi Moyel Bittel Rishus does not work. If you had a chotzer with Reuven, Shimon, and Levi got left out of the Reuven Chatzeros, Levi could be Mavatal Rishus to Reuven and Shimon. So if Reuven and Shimon joined in a Reuven Chatzeros, Levi got left out, Levi will be Mavatal Rishus to Reuven and Shimon, Ayin, Siman, Shin Pei, and Shin Pei Aleph, right? But over here, that it's Reuven, Shimon, and Tony can't be Mavatal Rishus. Right? By Yisrael, by Levi, Bittul Rishus helps, but not by Tony. V'atam deloy mahani. Why? Why doesn't it work? If Levi can be Mavatal Rishus to Reuven and Shimon, how come Tony can't be Mavatal Rishus to Reuven and Shimon? You'll have to teach Tony what it means, and maybe you'll have to say it in English. But why can't it work? Explains the Mishnah Berurah because of the same reason. Mishum deratzu chachamim larchu kei diras Yisrael min ha'akum. The Chazal did not want the Yidden living together with the Einam Yehudim. And therefore, Hichmiru, they were very machmer, the Ein Loi Takana, that you're not going to be able to rectify this situation until you're masker rishus from the Ein Yehudi. The Ein Yehudi is not going to want to do this. He's not going to be agreeable to this idea of being masker rishus. And I can tell you, Rabbi Isai, because it was negay to me. Many years ago, I had to be masker rishus from an Ein Yehudi, and he didn't want to do it. And I had to come up with another kula. I had to go to his teenage daughter, and I had to be masker rishus from his airhead teenage daughter, who the only thing that she cared about was the fact that she was getting a quarter. So she was masker rishus. But the father wasn't going to be masker rishus. The mother wasn't going to be masker rishus. They didn't want to do it. So the Chazal did that B'dafka. Now he is not going to want to live in a kotzah with an Yehudi because it's going to make him problems in the world of a Reuven Chatzeros. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you have to buy or rent the rishus from the Ein Yehudi. How about if you're not maskir rishus? You don't pay him. You get the Ein Yehudi to say he's going to lend his rishus to you. Tali b'shtei adayas amuvur b'sif yud beis. We're going to get to that in Sif Yud Beis. According to the first opinion, we're going to see over there it's not effective. I wanted to speak out a couple of biurei halacha here, which in my dreams I thought that we were going to finish this share in about a half hour. So I figured we'll have plenty of time for biurei halacha. There's kind of two fascinating biur halachas here. Dibra maskal oz hanachri oiser aleim, and later on tzarech she'askiru. But we're out of time, Rabbi Isai. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. Discussion of Liman HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shalom should send Yeshua for us, Parnasset, Sheduchim, and to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Biaskal Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu, amen. Be well.